Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Garrick Hale had long since stopped counting the years since he'd last felt anything resembling hope. The autumn of 1847 found him aboard what remained of his once proud vessel, the Sorrow's End, as she limped through the treacherous waters off the Maine coast, like a wounded animal seeking a place to die. The ship that had once struck fear into the hearts of merchant captains from Boston to Savannah was now little more than a floating coffin, her hull patched with whatever materials could be scavenged, her sails more holes than canvas. At 63, Garrick looked older than his years. The Atlantic had carved deep lines into his weathered face, and his once black hair had turned the color of storm clouds. His left leg, shattered by grape shot during a battle with a Spanish treasure galleon 15 years earlier, forced him to walk with a crude wooden crutch that had become as much a part of him as his own shadow. But it was his eyes that told the true story of his decline, gray as winter seas and empty as the graves of better men. The Sorrow's End creaked and groaned beneath his boots as he made his way across the deck, checking rigging that held together more through stubbornness than skill. His crew, once 30 strong, had dwindled to just 4 souls. Old Marcus, the cook, whose trembling hands could barely hold a ladle; young Tommy, barely 16 and green as spring grass; Ezra, the one-eyed quartermaster who'd lost his sight to a British cutlass; and Silent Pete, who hadn't spoken a word since watching his brother die during their last failed raid 6 months ago. They were ghosts sailing on a ghost ship, and Garrick knew it. The golden age of piracy had ended decades ago, crushed beneath the weight of expanding navies and changing times. Men like him were relics, dinosaurs clinging to a way of life that the world had already forgotten. The treasure they'd accumulated over the years had been spent on repairs, supplies, and bribes to harbor masters who looked the other way when the Sorrow's End limped into port. "Captain," Ezra called from his position near the wheel, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion they all felt. Storms building to the southeast. Bad one, by the look of the clouds. Garrick squinted at the horizon, where dark clouds were indeed gathering like an army of shadows. The wind had already begun to pick up, carrying with it the metallic taste that always preceded violent weather. In his younger days, he would have ordered the crew to batten down and ride out the storm with the confidence of a man who'd survived dozens of such tempests. But the Sorrow's End was in no condition for rough seas, and they all knew it. "How far to Pemaquid Point?" he asked, referring to the small fishing village where they'd hoped to resupply before winter set in. 6 hours in good weather," Ezra replied grimly. "Maybe 10 in what's coming." Garrick felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders, heavier now than it had ever been when he'd led a crew of cutthroats and adventurers across the Caribbean. Every decision could be their last, and the responsibility for these 4 remaining souls pressed down on him like a physical burden. How many good men had he led to their deaths over the decades? How many mothers would never see their sons again because of his ambition and greed? The memories came unbidden, as they often did during quiet moments aboard ship. There was Benjamin Cross, barely 20 when a Royal Navy cannonball took his head clean off during a raid near Charleston. William Murphy, who'd bled out on the deck of a captured merchant vessel while Garrick counted Spanish gold. James Fletcher, Thomas Reed, Samuel Morrison. Names carved into his memory like epitaphs on a tombstone that followed him wherever he sailed. "We'll make for the point," he decided, knowing they had little choice. "Rig the storm sails and secure everything that can move. If we can reach the lee of the headland, we might weather this one." But even as he gave the orders, Garrick could feel the sea's hungry patience. She'd been stalking him for decades, claiming his men one by one, wearing down his ship and his spirit with the persistence of water against stone. Perhaps tonight would finally be the night she collected her due. The storm struck with the fury of a vengeful god, just as darkness fell over the Maine coast. Waves the size of buildings crashed over the Sorrow's End's bow, sending torrents of icy water cascading across the deck. The wind howled through the rigging like the voices of the damned, and lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes that revealed the true scope of their peril. Garrick lashed himself to the wheel, his weathered hands fighting to keep the ship on course as she pitched and rolled through the mountainous seas. His crew worked desperately to keep her afloat, bailing water and adjusting sails with the frantic energy of men who knew they were dancing with death. The Sorrow's End groaned and shuddered with each impact, her ancient timbers crying out in protest against forces that seemed determined to tear her apart. "Captain!" Young Tommy's voice barely carried over the storm's roar. "Something's wrong with the main mast, she's starting to crack." Garrick looked up through the driving rain to see the thick wooden pole that had carried them through countless voyages beginning to bend under the pressure of wind and sail. If it snapped, they'd lose all steerage and be at the complete mercy of the storm. He was calculating their chances of survival when another lightning flash illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Rocks, jagged granite teeth rising from the foam like the fangs of some primordial beast, less than 100 yards off their starboard bow. They'd been driven much farther west than he'd realized, into the maze of shoals and hidden reefs that had claimed countless vessels over the centuries. The very waters where his own father's ship had been wrecked when Garrick was just a boy, beginning the chain of events that had led him to this moment. "All hands on deck," he bellowed, though he knew it was likely too late. "Drop anchor and prepare to abandon ship." But the sea had other plans. A wave larger than any that had come before lifted the Sorrow's End like a toy boat and hurled her toward the waiting rocks with the force of a battering ram. Garrick felt the wheel torn from his hands as the ship's keel scraped against submerged granite, and he knew with the certainty of a man who'd spent his life on the water that their luck had finally run out. The impact when it came was devastating. The Sorrow's End struck the rocks with a sound like thunder, her hull splitting open to spill men and cargo into the churning foam. Garrick was thrown against the ship's rail, his ribs cracking from the impact, and watched helplessly as his remaining crew was scattered like leaves in a hurricane. As he clung to the wreckage of his life's work, feeling the cold Atlantic claiming another piece of his soul, Garrick Hale wondered if this was how it would all end, alone in the darkness, with nothing but regret, and the ghosts of better men for company. The Sorrow's End died with the grinding shriek of splintering wood and the roar of rushing water that had haunted Garrick's nightmares since childhood. Her back broken on the unforgiving Maine granite, the ship that had been his home for over 3 decades, began her final descent into the dark Atlantic. Around him, debris from 40 years of piracy scattered across the foam-capped waves, broken barrels, torn canvas, and the personal belongings of men who would never need them again. Garrick found himself clinging to a section of the ship's rail, his broken ribs sending jolts of agony through his chest with every breath. The icy October water was already working its way through his heavy coat, leaching the warmth from his body with the patient hunger of death itself. In the chaotic darkness, illuminated only by sporadic lightning flashes, he caught glimpses of his surviving crew members struggling against the same fate that had claimed so many of their predecessors. Old Marcus was floating face down 20 yards away, his body moving with the lifeless rhythm of a man who'd finally found the peace that had eluded him in life. Young Tommy was nowhere to be seen, swallowed by waves that cared nothing for his 16 years of unlived dreams. Silent Pete thrashed desperately against the current that was pulling him toward the rocks, but Garrick could see it was a losing battle. Even Ezra, the most experienced sailor among them, was barely managing to keep his head above water as he clung to a broken mast. This was how it always ended for men like them, alone in the dark, claimed by the sea that had given their lives meaning and purpose. Garrick had watched it happen to dozens of good men over the decades, and now it was finally his turn to join their ranks. There was a certain justice to it, he thought through the haze of pain and exhaustion. After all the death he'd brought to others, perhaps drowning in these cold waters was exactly what he deserved. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Garrick prepared to release his grip on the rail and let the Atlantic claim him, another lightning flash revealed something that made him forget his own approaching death. There, perhaps 50 yards to the north, the broken remains of another vessel rode the waves like a wounded whale. But this wasn't the wreckage of some ancient ship claimed by the Maine coast's treacherous waters. The wood was too fresh, the debris too new. Another soul had been caught in tonight's storm, and then he heard it, barely audible over the howling wind and crashing waves, a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a knife through sailcloth, a voice, high and desperate, calling out in terror from somewhere in the darkness. Not the deep bellow of a seasoned sailor, but something else entirely. The frightened cry of someone who had no business being out here in these killing waters. "Help!" The voice came again, carried on the wind like a prayer offered to an indifferent god. "Please, somebody help me." Garrick's first instinct was to ignore the plea. He was dying himself. His ship was gone, and his crew was scattered to the four winds. What could one broken old pirate do for another soul caught in the storm's grip? But something about that voice, its youth, its raw terror, its complete desperation, reached past the layers of cynicism and bitterness that had accumulated around his heart like barnacles on a ship's hull. Another lightning flash, and Garrick saw the source of the cries. Clinging to a piece of what had once been a ship's mast, barely visible among the debris, was a small figure. Even through the driving rain and foam, he could see it was a child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, his dark hair plastered to his skull by the relentless waves. The sight hit Garrick like a physical blow. In all his years of piracy, through all the raids and battles and desperate escapes, he'd followed one unbreakable rule. Children were off limits. Merchant ships might carry gold and goods worth stealing, but innocent lives, especially young ones, were sacred. It was one of the few lines he'd never crossed, one of the last pieces of his humanity that the sea hadn't managed to claim. "Help me!" the boy cried again, his voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "I can't hold on much longer." The rational part of Garrick's mind calculated the odds with the cold precision of a man who'd survived by making hard choices. The child was at least 50 yards away through storm-tossed seas that had already claimed most of his crew. Garrick himself was injured, exhausted, and barely managing to stay afloat. Any attempt at rescue would likely result in 2 deaths instead of 1. But as he watched the boy struggle against the waves, something shifted inside Garrick's chest. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood, spent on these same dangerous waters with a father who died trying to save strangers from a wreck. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of all the deaths he'd caused over the decades, all the mothers who'd wept for sons who would never come home. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that after 63 years of taking from the world, here was finally a chance to give something back. "Hold on, boy," Garrick shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm's roar. "I'm coming!" He released his grip on the ship's rail and began swimming toward the child with strokes that sent fresh waves of agony through his broken ribs. The current fought against him with every movement, trying to drag him toward the same rocks that had claimed the Sorrow's End. Salt water filled his mouth and nose, and more than once he felt himself being pulled under by waves that seemed determined to finish what they'd started. But Garrick had spent his entire life fighting against impossible odds, and he wasn't about to give up now. He used the debris field to his advantage, grabbing onto floating barrels and broken timbers to rest when his strength flagged, then pushing off again toward the struggling child. Each lightning flash showed him a little closer to his goal, though he could see the boy's strength failing with each passing moment. "What's your name, lad?" Garrick called out when he was close enough to be heard, hoping to keep the child conscious and fighting. "Daniel," the boy gasped back, his small hands white-knuckled around the broken mast. "Daniel Morrison, my father, our ship, they're all gone." Morrison. The name hit Garrick like a cannonball to the chest. Samuel Morrison had been one of his crew members, lost during a raid gone wrong 3 years earlier. A good man, reliable in a fight and quick with a joke during the long hours between battles. Garrick had written the letter to his widow himself, explaining how her husband had died with honor in service to their brotherhood of rogues. But Samuel had never mentioned having a son. "Your father was Samuel Morrison?" Garrick asked as he closed the final distance between them, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and dread. "You knew him?" Daniel's eyes widened with desperate hope. "Please, sir, I can't swim much longer. The waves are so cold and I'm so tired." Garrick reached the boy just as his grip on the mast began to fail. Without hesitation, he wrapped his good arm around Daniel's small body and pulled him close, using his own bulk to shield the child from the worst of the waves. The boy was lighter than he'd expected, probably no more than 80 pounds soaking wet, but his presence seemed to give Garrick strength he didn't know he still possessed. "I've got you, lad," he said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "Your father was a good man, one of the best I ever sailed with. He'd be proud to see how brave you're being." Daniel clung to him with the desperate trust that only children possess, his small body shaking from cold and exhaustion. "Are we going to die out here?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Garrick looked around at the churning seas, the scattered debris, and the rocky coast that had claimed so many lives over the centuries. By all rights, they should both be dead already. But something had changed in the moment he'd decided to save this boy. The water seemed less cold, the waves less violent, as if the very ocean was taking notice of his choice. "Not tonight, Daniel," he said with more conviction than he felt. "Not tonight." Using a combination of swimming and floating on debris, Garrick began the long struggle toward shore, one arm wrapped protectively around Samuel Morrison's son, while the other fought against the current that wanted to claim them both. Behind them, the last remnants of the Sorrow's End disappeared beneath the waves, taking with them the final chapter of Garrick Hale's life as a pirate. But ahead of them, barely visible through the storm, lay the rocky coastline of Maine and the promise of a second chance that neither of them had expected to receive. The rocky shore of Maine felt like salvation beneath Garrick's bloodied knees as he dragged himself and Daniel Morrison from the grip of the retreating tide. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. His broken ribs sent jolts of fire through his chest with each labored breath, and his waterlogged clothes weighed him down like chains. But the boy was alive. That was all that mattered now. Daniel lay unconscious on the wet stones, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that told Garrick the lad would survive. The child's lips had turned blue from the cold Atlantic water, and his dark hair was matted with salt and seaweed. But there were no obvious injuries beyond exhaustion and exposure. Garrick pulled off his own coat, heavy and sodden as it was, and wrapped it around the boy's shivering form. The storm had passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and strangely quiet. Where hours before the wind had howled like a banshee and waves had crashed against the rocks with the force of artillery, now there was only the gentle whisper of receding water and the distant cry of seabirds greeting the dawn. The transformation was so complete it seemed almost supernatural, as if nature itself had decided that enough destruction had been wrought for one night. Garrick sat heavily beside Daniel, his back against a boulder that had probably witnessed 1,000 such wrecks over the centuries. The Maine coast was littered with the bones of ships that had underestimated these waters, and now the Sorrow's End had joined their ranks. 40 years of his life lay scattered across the sea floor, along with the last of his crew, and everything he'd once called his own. But strangely, he felt no grief for what he'd lost. Instead, there was something else growing in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak October sun beginning to rise over the eastern horizon. For the first time in decades, Garrick Hale had saved a life instead of taking one. The weight of that single act seemed to balance against all the darkness in his past, like a candle lit in a room that had been dark for far too long. Daniel stirred as the first rays of sunlight touched his face, his eyelids fluttering open to reveal brown eyes the same shade as his father's had been. "Sir?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from swallowing seawater. "Are we safe?" "Aye, lad," Garrick replied, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "We made it to shore. You're safe now?" The boy struggled to sit up, wincing as his muscles protested the movement. "The other ship, my father's friends, are they?" Garrick's expression darkened. He'd seen enough of the wreckage in the water to know that Daniel was likely the only survivor from whatever vessel had brought him to these treacherous waters. "I'm sorry, boy. The sea claimed them all." Daniel's face crumpled with grief, and he began to cry with the broken-hearted sobs of a child who'd lost everything in the span of a single night. Garrick found himself reaching out awkwardly to pat the boy's shoulder, unused to offering comfort but moved by an instinct he didn't fully understand. "Your father would be proud of how brave you were out there," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. Samuel Morrison raised a fighter. The mention of his father's name seemed to steady Daniel somewhat. "You really knew him. He told me stories about sailing with pirates, but I thought they were just tales to help me sleep." "Oh, they were real enough," Garrick chuckled, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. "Your father could tell a story that would make you believe the sea herself was listening. He had a way with words that could calm the roughest crew or talk us out of trouble in any port." As they sat together watching the sun climb higher over the Atlantic, Garrick found himself sharing memories of Samuel Morrison that he'd kept locked away for years. The time Samuel had talked their way out of a Spanish prison by convincing the guards he was a missionary. The night he'd stood watch during a fever epidemic, nursing sick crew members back to health while risking his own life. The way he'd always spoken of his family back home with a love so pure it made hardened pirates weep into their rum. "He never told us about you, though," Garrick admitted. "Samuel kept his family separate from the life he led at sea. Smart man, your father. He knew that world wasn't meant for children." Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "He was coming to get me. Mother died last spring, and I had nowhere else to go. He said we'd sail somewhere safe, somewhere I could grow up without worrying about people like me," Garrick finished quietly. I understand. Your father was trying to give you a better life than the one he'd chosen. They fell into companionable silence as the morning continued to brighten around them. The sea had calmed to an almost unnatural stillness, its surface reflecting the growing light like polished glass. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the rocky cliffs that rose behind them. And somewhere in the distance Garrick could see smoke rising from what was probably a fishing village where they could find shelter and help. But there was something else in the air now. Something that made the hair on the back of Garrick's neck stand up despite the warming sun. A presence, ancient and vast, that seemed to be watching them from somewhere just beyond the edge of perception. The old pirate had spent enough years on the water to recognize when the sea was paying attention, and right now he felt like they were standing in the center of a spotlight, whose source remained invisible. "Sir?" Daniel's voice carried a note of concern. "Do you feel that? Like someone's watching us?" Garrick nodded slowly, his weathered face grave. "Aye, lad. The sea's taking notice of what happened here tonight, and something tells me we're about to discover why." As if summoned by his words, a thick fog began rolling in from the horizon, moving against the wind with purposeful determination. It flowed across the water like a living thing, reaching toward the shore with ghostly tendrils that seemed to carry whispers from another world. And in that fog, Garrick began to see shapes that shouldn't exist, the silhouettes of men he'd thought lost forever, walking across the water toward the beach where he sat with Samuel Morrison's son. The fog rolled in like a living cathedral, its ghostly columns rising impossibly high against the morning sky. As it drew closer to the shore where Garrick and Daniel sat, the mist began to take on a luminescence that had nothing to do with the weak October sun. Threads of silver light danced within its depths, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of ancient memories and unfinished business. Daniel pressed closer to Garrick's side, his young eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "What's happening?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever spell was being woven around them. Garrick found himself unable to answer. In 40 years of sailing every ocean on Earth, he'd witnessed phenomena that defied explanation. St. Elmo's fire dancing on the rigging during storms, whales that seemed to sing in languages older than human speech, waters that glowed with their own inner light. But nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. The fog reached the shoreline and began to part like curtains drawn back from a stage, and there, walking across the calm waters as if they were solid ground, came the ghosts of every man Garrick Hale had ever lost to the sea. They moved in perfect silence, their translucent forms shimmering with the same silver light that filled the mist, their faces bearing the peaceful expressions of souls finally at rest. At the front of the procession walked Benjamin Cross, his head whole again despite the cannonball that had taken it decades ago near Charleston. Beside him strode William Murphy, no longer bleeding from the wounds that had claimed him, while Garrick counted Spanish gold. James Fletcher, Thomas Reed, Samuel Morrison himself, they were all there, along with dozens of others whose names Garrick had carved into his memory like epitaphs on a gravestone that followed him wherever he sailed. But these weren't the vengeful spirits he'd expected to face when death finally came calling. There was no anger in their ghostly faces, no accusation in their luminous eyes. Instead, they regarded him with something that looked remarkably like approval. "Father?" Daniel's voice broke with emotion as he recognized Samuel Morrison among the spectral assembly. The boy started to rise, but Garrick's weathered hand on his shoulder held him back. "Watch, lad," the old pirate whispered, his own voice thick with wonder. "I think they've come to say goodbye." Samuel Morrison stepped forward from the group, his ghostly form more solid than the others, as if the love for his son gave him greater substance in this ethereal realm. He smiled at Daniel with the same warmth Garrick remembered from their days aboard the Sorrow's End, then turned his attention to the man who had saved his child from the hungry sea. "Captain," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly despite seeming to come from a great distance. "You kept your promise." Garrick frowned, searching his memory. "What promise?" "I never—" "You did," Samuel interrupted gently. "Every time you told us that children were sacred, that innocent blood would never be on our hands. Every time you chose mercy over profit. Tonight you proved that those weren't just words spoken to ease our consciences. They were the truths you lived by, even when it cost you everything." Around Samuel, the other ghosts began to move into formation. They arranged themselves in perfect lines along the water's edge, 300 souls stretching as far as the eye could see in both directions. Pirates and sailors, good men and bad, united now in death by the brotherhood they'd shared in life. Each one stood at attention, their translucent forms glowing brighter as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. "We've been waiting," Benjamin Cross spoke up, his voice echoing strangely in the supernatural stillness. "Waiting for the moment when the balance would be restored, when the man who led us into darkness would step into the light. Waiting for you to remember," added William Murphy, "that beneath all the blood and gold and glory, there was still a good man fighting to get out." Garrick felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, salt water that had nothing to do with the Atlantic spray. "But the men I lost, the lives that were wasted because of my choices, were our choices too," James Fletcher said firmly. "We followed you willingly, Captain. We knew the risks and we accepted them. Every man who sailed under your flag did so because he believed in something greater than himself. And now," Samuel Morrison added, stepping closer to his son and the man who had saved him, "that belief has been justified. You risked everything for my boy, Garrick. You threw away your own chance at survival to save a child you'd never met. That's the man we always knew you could be." As one, the assembled ghosts raised their right hands in salute. The gesture was precise, military in its execution, but filled with a reverence that transcended any earthly ceremony. 300 souls acknowledging a debt finally repaid, a balance finally restored, a good deed that echoed backward through time to redeem decades of darker choices. The salute lasted for exactly 1 minute, though it felt like an eternity to Garrick. In that span of time, he felt the weight of 40 years of guilt lifting from his shoulders like chains being struck away by an invisible hammer. The ghosts of his past were releasing him, granting him the forgiveness he'd never thought to seek and certainly never expected to receive. "Your father was proud of you before," Garrick told Daniel, his voice steady despite the emotions churning in his chest. "But if he could see how brave you were last night, how you held on when any grown man might have given up, well, I think he'd burst with pride." Samuel Morrison smiled and nodded, then began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. One by one, the other ghosts followed suit, their forms becoming less substantial until they were nothing more than suggestions of light on the water. But their salute continued until the very last moment, hands raised in honor of a redemption none of them had lived to see. As the supernatural fog lifted and the sea returned to its normal blue-green color, Garrick found himself alone on the rocky shore with Daniel Morrison. The boy was crying again, but these were different tears, not the desperate sobs of grief, but the quiet weeping of someone who had witnessed something profound and transformative. "They forgave you," Daniel said simply, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of Garrick's oversized coat. "All of them. I could see it in their faces." Garrick nodded, feeling lighter than he had in decades. "Aye, lad. And in doing so, they've given us both a second chance. Your father's friends in that fishing village up the coast. They'll take you in, give you a proper home. And me," he paused, looking out at the calm waters that had claimed his ship but returned his soul. "Well, I suppose I'll find something useful to do with whatever years I have left." Daniel looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond his years. Could you stay? At least for a while? I don't have anyone else now, and you knew my father better than anyone." The request caught Garrick off guard. In all his years of piracy, he'd never considered what came after, what a man did when the sea finally finished with him. But looking down at Samuel Morrison's son, at this brave boy who had survived the same waters that had claimed so many good men, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope for the future. "Aye," he said, putting his arm around Daniel's shoulders as they began walking toward the distant smoke of the fishing village. "I think I'd like that very much." Behind them, the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface peaceful now and holding no trace of the supernatural assembly that had gathered to witness the redemption of Garrick Hale. But somewhere in its depths, 300 souls rested easier, knowing that the man who had led them into darkness had finally found his way back to the light.